Welcome to our Key Library. We have Eibhear Walshe, Peter Cunnningham, Dymphna Nugent. Dymphna Nugent is a regional print journalist and columnist, literary critic. She's a full-time journalist with Waterford News and Star. She has a particular interest in the changing landscape of Irish writing over the past decade. And Dymphna reviews books for the Irish Examiner, Writing.ie, Waterford News and Star, and make sure to listen back to her summer read recommendations from Claire Byrne, today with Claire Byrne yesterday, isn't that right? So she's a regular on Claire Byrne as well. So welcome to Arkeen Library. I'll hand you over now to Dymphna Nugent.
Thank you, Tracy. You're all very welcome. So I'm aware that many of you will be joining us from the Facebook stream, so you're most welcome. As Tracy said, we are here in Arkeen Libraries as part of the Bealtaine Festival, and I am joined by Peter Cunnningham and Eibhear Walshe, who are both extraordinary writers. So the event today is called How Fiction Reveals the Truths of History. And I think that over the next hour, you're going to hear both authors read from their respective works. You're going to hear very much about how important works such as Peter's and Eibhear's books have helped us to understand quite a lot about the changing Irish landscape, the political period, and the public and the private themes therein. So, Peter, I would come to you first, if I may. You are a Waterford writer, Peter, where we're continuing to claim you.
Okay.
And your most recent title is Freedom is a Land I Cannot See. It's an extraordinary piece of work set around 1920 to 1924, isn't that right?
That's right, yeah.
Is there a particular reason that you chose that time period, Peter? Are you drawn towards that in particular?
I sort of fell into 1920-24 because I suppose we're in this centenary of these extraordinary events that has formed this country. I came across, about 4 years ago, I was moving books around, and I came across a whole lot of books that had belonged to my family, my father, all published in about the 1960s and 50s and 60s, dealing with perhaps the 50th anniversary of 1916, inspired by that. Really interesting books. For example, two books about Kevin O'Higgins, by Michael Collins, books by St. John Gogarty, and I became, one of the great things about it, about historical fiction, is that it gives you an excuse to immerse yourself endlessly in a period that you're attracted to, and then to bore your friends for years with everything you know, because I actually discovered so much about this, and of course the centenaries occurring, I thought it was appropriate that I would stay in that period, and I discovered so much, and this book is the first result of that research.
Extraordinary. And Eibhear, if I may come to you, just to touch upon what Peter has just said about immersing yourself completely in a particular period, not just your latest work, but much of your previous works have been around a particular writer, and that would definitely attest to what Peter has said about immersing yourself in a particular period of time. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and just to say a big thanks as well to Peter, who's suggested, to Tracy and to Dymphna and to everybody for having this lovely event. Lockdown, Peter and I were emailing each other during it, and just it cut us all off from books in terms of live events. So it's lovely just to be back and be able to talk about books again, and see lovely friends as well here, and be able to enjoy the event. And it's this idea of, the idea of immersion. I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been writing a new novel over the last 2 years, and I decided to make it about lockdown because, well, what else? We couldn't go anywhere. And then I decided to set it in Dunmore because I couldn't go there. So my next novel, if it all goes well, will not only be a lockdown novel, but also be a novel based in Waterford. Well, actually more in Dunmore than Waterford. But I suppose I was stuck in my house in Cork, not able to do the most simple thing, which is to come to Waterford to see Mum, and then we could go out to Dunmore and have a lovely walk and do, all the things we couldn't do So bizarrely, having spent all my life researching writers and travelling around to see where they were, the whole experience of writing lockdown to me was a really, I'm sure we all felt that, a very strong sense of being cut off just from our everyday lives. So where did my imagination go? It went back to here, this place. But in the previous work, for example, this novel came out the first week of lockdown, and I thought it was going to die a death. I really thought, this is it. I spent all my time writing this book, thinking about Elizabeth Bowen, travelling to London, going to North Cork, spending time in Dublin. I had to go to Rome a lot, which wasn't easy. But you know, I suppose if you have to do the work, you have to do the work, you know. And travelling around, following her everywhere. And then the book came out, and I thought, it's going to absolutely, who's going to read anything in this world, March 2020? But the reality was, it sold the best. Lots of people read it, and like myself, I'm sure, and like everybody else, all of us who read, we read 20 more, we read so much during lockdown, because we were longing to get out there and to travel, and it sold really well. Copies are available for purchase at the end of this book at reasonable prices. But anyway,
with the added benefit of being signed.
Well, indeed. So for me then, before this, writing was also about going to places that the writers my first novel was about a woman called Mary Travers, who sued Oscar Wilde's mother. My second novel was about Handel coming to Dublin to perform Messiah, and then my third novel was about Elizabeth Bowen, the Irish writer, and about her life during the Second World War. So I suppose each time I had to go and try and immerse myself in the worlds that they lived in. So history was important. A 19th century novel, an 18th century novel, a 20th century wartime novel. So yeah, each time, and I know Peter, certainly he's in the novel, he talks about research, he talks about history, and I know he's great interest in politics, for example. And for me, that's also part of the same thing. It was an interesting process, not a very pleasant one, and I wouldn't want it again, to find yourself deprived of the normal ways of writing a book, by having to stay in your house. So let's see what the product will be of that. But actually, research, travel, immersing yourself in their lives, that's for me part of the whole process of writing.
And Peter, I know we had spoken earlier about the fact that much of what came to be your 2017 work, Acts of Allegiance, came from papers and books that had been in your possession. I mean, that idea of total immersion, is it difficult? I mean, is it emotionally difficult to wade through that kind of content?
Not really. I inherited a lot of primary documents that had been my father's. He had been a D-Day lander. He's the only Irishman to win an MC on D-Day, and he got another one in Holland. He never spoke about it. And when we moved house, and we were transferring furniture as one does, we found a box of papers which were all original D-Day documents. Everybody who'd been involved in the landing, from the smallest, lowest private up to the highest general, had to write a personal report and submit their report. And there were all these reports, all told from different sides of the whole, like a, you know, such a encompassing report. These are all now in Trinity College. Just before he died, he came up and he donated them to Trinity, and I have copies of them all. So they're fascinating inside. I think when you write a novel, you absorb all this, and then you take a step away, and you have your own character in the novel who takes over the thing. Mm-hmm. So in my case, I use the material very much to talk in Acts of Allegiance, to talk about how allegiances are strained in times of war, and how allegiances are the result of pressures at different times in history. Particularly nowadays, when everything you hear said about things that the truth is so elusive. So everything you say including the war today, that a hospital was bombed, 600 people were killed, and we say that's awful, and you've got documentary evidence, and then the other side come out and say that's fake news. That didn't happen. That is not the truth, and this distortion of the truth throws a question mark over history. And fiction has a fantastic fiction is the witness to the emotional truth of history. Fictional characters intrude. History is meant to, people mostly think that history is safe because it's dates and people and names and places. History is safe. Fiction is made up, so history is unsafe. But when you combine the two together, you get a fantastic result that you can actually see parts of the truths of history that fiction allows you to do that.
And it has often been remarked that you have this combination of sensitivity and historical accuracy and knowledge. Are you very aware of that when you're writing, that you are presenting something that people may perceive as an accurate representation?
Well, I think when you're writing historical fiction, you're not being factual. You don't have, as long as Barry Unsworth said, as long as what you're writing in the fictional side is probable. It doesn't have to be actually true because you're making it up, as long as it's probable. Hilary Mantel, the Wolf Hall, the Thomas Cromwell trilogy that she wrote, she said that historians dislike historical fiction because it shows up, this is a quote from her, it shows up their own lack of education because they don't know what parts of it you're making up. So but you have to be really sure of your facts and then build your fiction onto that and around that.
We might take this opportunity, we're going to have a reading from both Peter's work and Eibhear's work. So Peter, we might come to you if you wish. In your own time, Peter is going to read an extract for us.
I am. Thank you. Well, I had just a preliminary. This is set in Sutton in County Dublin. My mother came from Sutton, and I spent quite a lot of my childhood in Sutton up to the age of about 6. And so I'm really at home in that part of just Waterford, but also in that part of County Dublin. And this is set in a simple cottage called Nan's Cottage. It's in 1920, and my purpose in this novel is to show that that when extraordinary events are happening, and in 1924, of course, from 1916, in Ireland the events were extraordinary by any yardstick. It was absolutely extraordinary what was happening. They were taking on the largest empire the world had ever known, with a whole group of sort of dreamers, and you can say think whatever you like about what happened at any stage, but the project that they were involved in was extraordinary. To people living in 1920 in places like Sutton, I guess, but particularly in Dublin, where there was so much emphasis of the rising had taken place, Dublin lay in ruins. In 1920, the centre of Dublin, O'Connell Street, the GPO was a shell, and there were a variety of opinions, like there are now on all big events. That some people could not bring themselves to think that the British would ever leave. They didn't want change. They wanted the British to stay. The British had invested in Ireland for centuries, built all the bridges, the railways, the ports. They didn't want them to leave. Then there were those who took the opposite view, that they couldn't leave fast enough, and that independence was actually within our grasp, even though it had been so tantalising for many years. And then there was another strand of people who couldn't care less, one way or the other. What happened? So just as today, so in the microcosm of this book, the families involved, they have all different views. You've got Tommy, the Raven family. You've got Tommy, who's Not a very original name, actually, since he's a British soldier from Leicester. But anyway, his name is Tommy, and he is he just doesn't want to cause trouble. His wife Annie is pro-empire. She really wants the Brits to stay. Her children, Rose and Ulton, they know that change is coming. And so Rose is the narrator, and we meet them one day as Rose and Ulton are walking home to Nan's cottage in Sutton. My brother and I were part of a new generation in which change, not permanence, would define our lives. Change was afoot and swiftly, as Ulton told me when he came home at night from the newspaper office in Middle Abbey Street, where a few months earlier he had begun work as an office boy. Change was devouring people's minds, not just across Europe, but in Dublin too, he said. Ireland was now in a state of permanent insurrection, although few in authority admitted it. Nothing would ever be the same again, he said. Try telling that to Tommy and Annie, I said. On the slight incline 100 yards from Nan's cottage, a tall and gangling young man dressed in the white jacket and bow tie of a hotel waiter suddenly appeared. His shoes looked too big for him, and it seemed as if he might topple over. As we came face to face, he drew up. "Hello, Rose, you look smashing this morning." "If you say so, Eddie." "Where's your Enfield, Kidney?" Ulton asked, "or has it been confiscated?" Eddie Kidney's face was livid with pimples, and he had a way of staring when he spoke. "You hardly think I'm going to bring it to work, do you, Ulton the Sultan?" He laughed. "Ulton the Sultan!" "You smell like a tart, Kidney," Ulton said. "Come on, Rose." They'd been in the same class at school when Eddie's father was killed in the Rising, although it was said that Ted Kidney had been shot as he looted a shop in Mary Street. Eddie now worked in the dining room of the Marine Hotel in Sutton. It was unfair of Ulton to make fun of Eddie's beliefs, since I knew Ulton too believed in a free Ireland. "I've got balcony tickets for the picture house, Rose," Eddie said. "One of them's for you." "Maybe another time, thanks." "One day you'll say yes," Eddie said. "Can the IRA not give you a better uniform, Kidney?" Ulton asked. "You want to be careful with that mouth of yours, Sultan," Eddie said. "You better hurry up or you'll miss parade," Ulton said, walking backwards. "Up, 2, 3, 4. "Feck you, you dirty son of a Brit," Eddie said and spat as he turned and walked off. "Fuck you, you sad little rebel shite," Ulton called after him. We continued up towards home. "There's no need to be so unkind," I said, "especially since you both share the same point of view." "I don't care what his point of view is, I hate him," Ulton said. "It was Kidney and his mates who set fire to the hay in Barnmere's last winter. £100 worth of damage. There's no proof." "What would have happened if there had been children in the barn?" Ulton said. "We used to play up there when we were kids." "Stop it, please. Still steer well clear of him," Ulton said. "He's a dangerous little bastard, mark my words." Will I keep going? We came up from the sea, the sun on our backs, the blue sky so enormous and faith-giving that it was hard to imagine the country was not contented. Our parents knew their place. It was the way they had been formed and lived their lives. Upon their marriage, they had moved into quarters in Marlborough Barracks, 2 rooms and a scullery, a rare privilege granted on the strength of esteem in which Papa was held by his regiment. Diligent, hard-working and loyal Tommy Raven had been a cavalry groom, but he became allergic to the dust in the stables, which made it impossible for him to work with horses. Most men would have been invalided out, but Tommy was so liked that his officers made him a barracks orderly, gave him a smart tunic, put him in the officers' mess. Tommy's station in life was to serve, and he excelled. His ready acceptance of life's immutable structures, his happy face and his refusal to complain made his superiors smile for Tommy Raven. Papa was a hard-working, humble man whose only personal indulgence was a flutter on the horses, which he followed avidly, especially Chanticleer's notes in the Irish Times. I kept my eyes on my plate as Annie spooned out butter-glowing cabbage. I often wondered how Ultan and I could be the children of these two people. Ultan, tall and broad with his lovely clean limbs, his hair like summer hay, and his bright blue eyes stood as a contrast to his father, almost too extreme to be explained. Tommy looked so much older than 52 years. My mother too, despite her energy, seemed newly stooped, as if bad news was ever expected. Ultan and I, blossoming with the sun, our lives ahead of us, like waiting treasure, seemed a different species to Tommy and Annie. It was as if we had discovered the secret to something they had never known. A lot of trouble in town, Annie said, or so I hear. Tommy shook his head as if by doing so he could forestall a discussion whose conclusion was laden with uncertainty. Being caused mainly by factions of the British Army, Ultan said. And when Annie looked at him severely, ask anyone. If the country wasn't against them before, it is now. The government is only responding, she said, responding to the ruffians who are trying to bring this city to its knees. I'm not sure they're all ruffians, Tommy began. Ruffians, my mother repeated. Mrs. Wilder had a gentleman from the castle to dinner last week who told her it'll all be over by Christmas. Ultan said. I wonder what he meant by over. My mother had a way of establishing her authority in an argument by sighing and closing her eyes. The disruptive elements will be rounded up and deported to Van Diemen's Land, she said, following which the king will visit Dublin and make a tour of the country. It's what the people want. Tasmania, Tommy said, is what it's called. Does it matter what it's called? Asked my mother sharply. Lunch proceeded in silence. Although Ultan believed in the cause of Ireland's self-government and the men who were taking a stand against the British, he would never admit it in front of Annie. In fact, of the four of us, she was the only one fully committed to preserving Ireland's status in the Empire. Our Sunday ritual had remained unchanged for years. We always used what was called the good cutlery, Sheffield plated knives and forks, a wedding present to my parents from Annie's family. Among my daydreams at such times were sailing away forever, living in a house of my own, and finding a man I could love for the rest of my life, regardless of his station. Are you up or down with Mr. Silverstein these days, Papa? Ultan inquired cheekily. I could never dare ask such a question. Your papa brought me home a florin last week, didn't you? Annie said warmly. He's very clever at cards. Tommy shone under her approval. Twice every month he played in a poker school that included Mr. Silverstein, someone he'd known in the barracks. Most of Tommy's friends were leftovers from his army days, men in some cases who had served, or like Mr. Silverstein, had provided services to the Crown forces. In Mr. Silverstein's case, he still delivered beer to the officers' mess in Marlborough Barracks. I might soon need that florin back if Mr. Chanticleer lets me down, ma'am, Tommy said. For a moment Annie's eyes became enlarged. Hey-ho, only joking, he said. We all laughed to show our support. You should be working in the music hall, Annie said.
Thank you very much. Eibhear, it is your turn.
Okay.
So Eibhear, we're also going to, and just for our audience members here, there will be time for question time at the end, should anybody have something that they would like to ask either Peter or Eibhear, so I will come to you towards the end of today's event. Eibhear, could you tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear here
Sure.
in the last day of Bowen's Court?
Yeah, so the novel, and this is actually a picture of Elizabeth Bowen we were very lucky to get, it's very hard to see from the cover, but it's taken in the 1930s at her house in Bowen's Court. So the novel is based on the life that, and what Peter said is very interesting. A novel can go where history can't go, and Peter put it very well. So what I tried to do is understand the life of the Irish writer Elizabeth Bowen, particularly her life in London during the Second World War, during the Blitz. Bowen herself, there's been even questions in her lifetime and after whether she was Irish, and because she was Anglo-Irish, and she said herself, of course she was Irish. And her wartime activities in London included reporting for the British Ministry of Information on Irish neutrality, for which she got in a lot of kind of posthumous trouble in Ireland, because she wrote these secret reports. She came back to Ireland every summer during the war and reported on Ireland. And she defended Irish neutrality, interesting considering the debate we're having again at the moment. And she said that Ireland, it was a question of self-respect for the new state. Bowen thought that she really could interpret Ireland for the British establishment. You think of the anger particularly of Churchill towards De Valera and, you know, the difficulties that happened. And she once said in her report that she wished that the English could keep history in mind a little bit more and the Irish keep history in mind a little bit less. As Peter was talking about Ukraine, but we could talk about Northern Ireland, we could talk about EU, Brexit protocols. Bowen was addressing all of these things at the time, the treaty ports. She was trying to explain and translate the reason for Irish neutrality to the British establishment, and did her no favours in Ireland. I don't think she actually cared that much, but anyway, that was one of my interests. But my main interest was to understand something personal about her. How could Bowen, who lived, and I think was happily married to her husband Alan Cameron from 1922 to his sudden death at the end of 1959, they lived in London and they came to Bowen's Court every summer. In the course of that life and that marriage, she had a long-term affair relationship with a Canadian, a man called Charles Ritchie. And she wrote her best novel, The Heat of the Day, based during the Second World War in London. And she dedicates the novel to Charles Ritchie. How do you manage that? How do you maintain, I think, a happy and successful marriage with a portrait, a picture of the man that you're in love with on the mantelpiece in your house in London, and then dedicate the novel? And more importantly, but I won't give you away because you have to read the novel to tell you the other part, how do you negotiate that marriage, particularly with what happens in his life at the same time? And that was one of my focuses, both the personal and the private and the public. How do you live in this world? So what I'm going to read is the okay, so the novel takes place, they meet in 1941. So let me just give you the first moment that she sees Charles Ritchie. So this is 1941. The 1st February of the war, sorry, actually the 2nd February, it's 1941. The beginning of their siren years. Unexpectedly, he became her lover when London was in peril, at a time when Elizabeth felt as if she were moments away from random, senseless obliteration. Knowing this, and falling in love with Charles all through the spring and summer of 1941, she knew fear and excitement in equal measure, saw nothing but his slender face and hands, and heard only his voice, felt the touch of his mouth on hers. In the most terrifying time of her life, wondering if each morning at a typewriter would be her last, she found an excitement she learned to love. She remembered the moment she first saw him. It was during the christening. He was sitting ahead of her in the church. It was his dark hair and his neck that first drew her attention to him. Sitting there, she began to imagine touching that neck, feeling the strong tendons, the warm skin under her caressing fingers. It was only when Alan jabbed her with his elbow did she come to her senses and stand up. Afterwards, standing at the church porch, the tall young man in the dark suit glanced at her, and then after a moment lost interest and turned away elsewhere. She told herself with determination that if she had her chance, someday this young man would not turn away from her. So they do get to know each other, and she's in her apartment with her husband. She's writing her novel, and it's they're the centre of London in Regent's Park, Clarence Terrace, where they lived. In the afternoons, her writing done, she stood in the window overlooking the park and told herself, I can live in these two worlds. I can. I can endure the everyday world while counting the minutes until I can escape to the other, the dream world. Once, staring out of the window, waiting for Charles to call in for a drink, she turned to find Alan looking at her. The park's closed again, she told him. Another unexploded bomb. Alan said nothing, continuing to look at her, then turned abruptly to leave. She shrugged, unwilling to think about the look in Alan's eyes as he stared at her. So, one evening she's walking along by the National Gallery in London in April, and unexpectedly Charles passes in a taxi. He gets out, and they walk and go and have a drink. Charles told her about a small nightclub nearby in Baker Street, where he sometimes went to drink in the evenings, and they walked there. Now, conspicuously alone together, this made her even more tongue-tied as they drank vermouth and listened to the band. A loud table of 10 or more people in full evening dress sat right next to them. In their midst, a woman, near her own age, with pale blonde hair and a worn look, sat with a small fox fur slung around her shoulders. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth realised that the woman kept looking at them. Finally, she mentioned it to Charles. Charles, I do believe we're under surveillance. He glanced around and caught the eye of the woman, sitting at the edge of the large party. She was expensively made up, an unfinished drink before her. Her companions were talking around her, but no one seemed to be talking to her. She kept drawing on and off her oscillate gloves. As she did, she glared over at Charles. Do you know her? Never saw her before in my life. The woman started gathering up her gloves and her bag, tugging her fox fur more tightly around her. And then swaying slightly on her feet, she walked towards them. Charles looked up but stayed sitting where he was. I just want to say, young man, she said, in a soft, whispery kind of voice, her face hesitant, somehow unfocused, that you should be ashamed of yourself, not to be in uniform. She stopped. He sat impassively, staring up at her. The woman shook off the arm of an older man who had come to behind her and was attempting to draw her away. Charles sat smoking, his eyes fixed on the woman, his gaze unruffled. The woman turned towards Elizabeth. A look of real venom came into her face. And as for you, at your age, Charles cut across her quietly, sharply. You are disturbing us. Charles looked up at the woman, and she stopped. Elizabeth wondered how the woman could stand there so calmly, his long, handsome face now transformed by a forbidding look that froze up all conversation from her by force of expression. Why was the woman not more afraid of him? And then the woman leaves. And she says, you know, she remarked, more for something to say, that was unpleasant, but these days I always feel that there's a third at our table. Charles looked at her quizzically. You mean Alan? No, actually, I meant the war. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Eibhear. Eibhear, I have a number of questions, if I may, about this, because Elizabeth Bowen is a novelist that many, to be fair, may not have read, particularly today, given that there are such a wealth of new writers and there's a lot of changing interests. So works such as yours are bringing Elizabeth Bowen's back to the fore. Did you feel a tremendous responsibility writing a book like this, where you are reimagining the conversations she may have had, the events which may have happened?
Yes, I mean, one of the things I'm aware of, and when I was listening to Peter, he was doing the accents and of the various characters, and of course he has different class and different places, and the father is English. I was very conscious of something, which is that my novel is based mainly in the Anglo-Irish and Canadian English upper class of the Second World War, not a world I grew up in. and we're very much distant from that time. So one of the things I wanted to get right was how they would speak to each other. And I just did something very simple. I read lots and lots of letters from people like Nancy Mitford, Evelyn Waugh, Bowen herself, her own diaries, her letters, Charles Ritchie's diaries. So, and then Peter has demonstrated that in his own reading. You know, we're from Waterford, we grow up in our worlds, we have our own accents, our own education, everything. And then we have to transfer ourselves into all these different people. So I was very conscious of that. I wanted to get that right. And luckily we have a lot of Bowen's own writings. So I used a lot of our own fiction. The other thing is that I stole from all of her own fiction, and I'm not going to pretend that. I'm happy to say I ripped off large amounts of her work. So for example, she and Charles Ritchie go to Hythe for a weekend to a hotel. This happened in a novel that she wrote in the 1930s, even before she met Charles Ritchie. A couple who shouldn't be together have a weekend away in a hotel. When at the end of this section, she and Ritchie go out into Regent's Park and they wander around by night in the moonlight during the blackout. Bowen has a story about a young couple who have nowhere to go, who have to wander around the city at night. So I just took everything I could from her work. It's a novel. It's made up. It's not true. It's an attempt to explain something we just don't know. And again, I know from reading Peter's novel, I won't spoil the ending because I loved it, but he brings that right into relief. What novels can do where history stops. And really, the whole idea I wanted to do was in the novel was, I don't know what happened in Elizabeth Bowen's private life. We have her letters, we have her diaries, we have her novels, her stories. It's a guess. There's quite a mystery about her marriage. I offer a solution. It could be right, it could be wrong. One of the kind of easy explanations for her marriage was that Alan Cameron was gay. I think that's too easy. I think it kind of suggests a kind of cop-out in one way, because it seems to me that in Bowen's, and I'm very interested in this myself, in Bowen's society and her world and her class, people who were sexually different lived their lives. Her best friend was Eddie Sackville West, and he lived as he wanted. He had a partner all his life. They had money and they had the world. They could be who they wanted. And Bowen was who she wanted. But I wanted to write about a marriage that was successful but unconventional. And I suppose that's one of the things I try to explore. You try and get the details right. You try and get the accent right. You try and get the words right. They're not going to say babes to each other. But, at the same time, I don't know what went on privately between them. And I suppose a novel gives you the license. It's as good a guess as any. And I suppose Bowen herself as a novelist, I hope, would understand that, fiction is... I've written biography, so I wrote a biography of Kate O'Brien, and I had to stay with the facts. And I had to try and get them, and a lot of them were missing, because her life was hidden and missing. With Bowen, I could write what I wanted.
Do you use that app? I use an app which is historical ages the words. What do you call that one?
I don't, but I
do, because say you said they don't say babes to each other. But if you're writing historical fiction, it's extraordinary the amount of words we use nowadays that simply didn't exist at that time, or that would be used in different. So I have to check all the words to make sure that each verb was actually used at the time. I'll send you.
Thank you.
It's a fantastic app. Emma O'Donoghue gave it.
Brilliant.
And it's you just type in the word and it tells you the origin of the word and the first known use date the word was used. Yeah, it's fantastic.
The other thing is that I'd never used the word shall. It's not a verb I use, and I was determined that Bowen and Ritchie would use it because it's not. So it's as I say, it's words, but it's also what an English
fashion
person
of the time.
Yes, and also a difference between England and Ireland, and their education.
Yeah.
But you see, both Bowen and Ritchie were kind of outsiders. He was Canadian. And I think they were kind of conscious of that as well. But I didn't know about the app.
Shall and shan't.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we would never use that.
No.
And you've spoken, Eibhear, about your work. So you've written about Kate O'Brien, writer and literary activist. You've obviously written about Elizabeth Bowen. Is there a particular reason that you have chosen such strong women who broke the mould and left a legacy in their own right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I started studying literature as a student. I was a student in, say, 79. So all my life I've been working in the area of literature and so I was a student for many years, and then I worked as a lecturer, and now I'm working also as a novelist and as a writer. So, and here we are in a library, and I've been incredibly fortunate that my entire life has been books, and it's paid as well, which is nice too. I get to spend my life doing what we're doing this morning, but I do this for a living. I mean, how lucky am I? Tomorrow I'm going to meet two of my students who are doing MAs, and they're working on their theses, and I get to talk to them about their work, and that's my job, and I put work into it. So, but when I started in UCD in 79, we studied very few women writers. So that was something I noticed. And Kate O'Brien, for example, I found her books in the library. No one was teaching her. She was like me. She was from a provincial Munster. She was from Limerick. She'd gone to Dublin to study. She went off to Spain. She loved opera. She was interested in poetry and literature. And she lived a very kind of different life in terms of her sexual identity. I never heard of her. It might have helped me back then if I'd been reading her. And I suppose that was part of it. But Dymphna, you and I were talking beforehand that kind of what we can write about in Ireland has changed so much in the last, say, I don't know, even say 30, 40 years. Like, when I wrote my memoir, in 2008, 2009, that was probably something I couldn't have written 10 years before, or published 10 years before. And some of the novels I've been writing, it's part of a changing world. And, all of us as novelists, and Peter does this, all of us do. We're changing and changing as we're going along to what we can write about. And I dimly remember 1966, that wonderful TV series, what was it called? RTE did on The Rising. It was called Insurrection? Insurrection. I vaguely remember it. I don't know if you remember it, Liam. It was when we were very young. It was the 40th anniversary of 1916. And then just think of what was, say, the last few years. The history of the uprising has changed so radically in our life. I didn't know that when Pierce came out, it was, what was the woman who accompanied him? What was the name of the woman? The woman who was the nurse. What was her? I can't remember her name. Anyway, she was taken out of the photograph because the two of them, Pierce, and I'm sorry, I should remember her name, this is really bad. Can I remember her? Anyway, she was one of the women inside 1916. She was working there as a nurse. She was with Pierce, and they were together. Her photograph was taken out because it had to be only Pierce at that moment, not by his wish, but by the way in which the history that we've had has changed. I don't think Bowen is particularly part of our history up to now. Like the Anglo-Irish got written out really after the formation of the new state. So I suppose, that's the way that
she is now.
She's back again. Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. With that in mind, I'd come to our audience here today, and there's quite a large gathering here. I'm delighted to see. Would anybody have any questions that they'd like to put to either Peter or Eibhear about their works or about anything that we have heard today?
Eibhear, Peter, can you think of examples where the novelist has had the temerity to change the facts? I'm not thinking about counterfactual novels now, but I'm thinking of the ones where, let's say, Hilary Mantel kills off a character and stays alive.
Well, I've done it. In my first novel, because I got a few emails about it. One of the main characters, the main character's sister, I invented an entire episode that happens to her. It didn't happen, and that's, you can check, because somebody did email me and they checked the census and they said, hang on, they were alive at this point. So I decided, and the person emailed me and said, why did you do it? And I said, well, I needed something happening in the life of the character that they were ignoring. But I changed a fact quite substantially. I can't think of any others, Peter. I'm sure people have.
Well, I just go back to the thing. So when you're writing historical fiction, you're not trying to write about facts. You're trying to uncover truths of what happened around facts. And so therefore, what you write and what you invent, all it has to be is probable. It can't be impossible. It can be probable, and you can defend it on that basis. I think that's the safest rule.
Thank you both. Are there any other questions for Peter and Eibhear?
A question for both of you. Starting off the novel, you have a general end game in sight, or does the novel develop itself into a novel?
Well, when I start off, I have a very general idea of the beginning, the middle, and the end. I can just see it in it. But as to how that is populated within the novel, from the first attempts early on to the final thing, there's very little resemblance. It completely changes as I go through, but not the outline. So how you achieve that is what, for me, so a vague idea, but a strong vague idea. Yeah.
I always write the ending pretty much first. No, I haven't done it at the moment.
Good choice.
Yeah, because I know where I want to go, but often where that ending ends up might be moved to the middle, or it might be moved somewhere else. It's like I know where probably use the same sense. I know where I want to go, but as to how I get there and who gets to be on the journey, because the characters you think are going to be a really big part of it, and then the really dangerous things happen is somebody really interesting comes along, which isn't the main character, and they threaten to sort of overbalance it, and then characters come out of nowhere. When I was writing the novel on Handel, I got fascinated by this woman. She existed. She was known as the Beanpole, but she was the mistress of George I. She was a German woman who ended up living in England, and she came to live with him. But she was the patron of Handel, and they were quite good friends. She was actually Duchess of Munster at one point. She got made a title and then she discovered that it was an Irish title, and she kicked up a huge fuss. It wasn't good enough, so he made her Duchess of Kendal as well in England. So she wasn't good enough to rule Munster, but she's a real person. So she almost took over the whole thing. But you have to fight that back and stay with what you want to start with.
Well, taking Eibhear's thing that he writes the ending first. For the first time in my career, I have probably done that in my new novel, which doesn't come out till next year. But the clue to the ending lies in the working title of the novel, which is The Assassination of Kevin O'Higgins. So that's kind of a giveaway. So that allows me to write the ending first. Yeah.
Thank you both for such responses. I thank you all for coming today, for being such a wonderful audience, and I specifically thank both Peter and Eibhear. They have shared such extraordinary insight with us today. They have opened our eyes to periods of history that we may otherwise not have been exposed to. And I know that for anybody tuning in on the Facebook feed, you're in for such a treat if you have not already read both titles. They are available from Waterford Libraries, they are available from the Book Centre, and if you are lucky enough to be here today, you will pick up a signed copy on your way out for a fee, of course. Thank you very, very much, and thank you to Waterford Libraries.
Thank you.